Hey everyone, if you love documentaries on true crime, mysteries, and the darker side of human nature, then be sure to check out my new channel, Saturn Soul. You can find the link to subscribe to Saturn Soul down below. Thank you, and enjoy. I'm a woman in my 20s, and this happened to me a few years ago, and it still gives me chills to think about. It's kind of ridiculous, and I can look back on it with friends and laugh now, but it was absolutely heart-wrenching at the time. It started when I was walking home from work one summer evening. My car was in the shop, and I didn't want to take the bus because I can't stand the smells. It's kind of a running joke with my loved ones. I have an incredibly sensitive nose, and I get bothered by smells pretty easily. And that's how I first became alerted to the guy following me. I could smell the strong scent of dead fish. At this point, I'd walked a couple of blocks, and this foul, lingering scent was persistent. At first, I assumed it was the area. I lived in a coastal town where fishing is a core aspect of our commerce, so the smells associated with fishing aren't uncommon. They weren't usually around my area of the town, though, because why would I choose to live in an area that stank of fish when I have a sensitive nose? So it was a bit unusual for it to reek this bad, and that's when I wondered if it was someone, not something, who was serving as that source of the smell. Since I was alone, I didn't want to attract anyone's attention, so I ducked into a nearby alcove and pretended to check my phone while scanning my surroundings. There was a man, about 30 feet behind me. He caught my eye because he was stumbling along, not drunk as such, but almost like he had a limp. And then when I stopped, he quickly found a reason to stop too, pausing at a bench to tie his shoelace. I'm not normally the type of person to assume I'm the center of attention, but it was so obvious to me that this guy was following me, and so I tested it out, moving along the street some and then stopping to check my phone. And sure enough, every time I stopped, he would stop too. A few more times, and I was certain this guy was following me. He kind of looked disheveled, and I noticed he was wearing a waterproof fishing coat, even though it was a very warm day. He had a scraggly black beard, a beanie cap, and he was carrying a huge brown fabric bag. I could see wetness soaking through the bottom of that bag, and I figured that was where the smell of the fish was coming from. And it seemed like he had his catch for the day, and maybe he wanted to add me to the net. Gross. I was only a block or two from home now, and so I hurried, and there was this panic building up inside me about what I'd do when I got home. There was nowhere else nearby that I could go, which meant that he'd see the apartment where I lived. Not much I can do, I figured. Either I hung around and he potentially caught me, or I darted inside my 3-story apartment and locked the front door behind me. And so that's what I did, and then I watched through the front window, hidden out of sight, while the guy kind of lingered outside for a while before scurrying off. He looked lost and confused, and I wondered if maybe I'd been imagining it after all, or there had been some innocuous explanation for the following. Regardless, I informed the building superintendent, who I got along with pretty well, about my concerns, and he assured me that there was no way any weird men stinking of fish were getting into the apartments. Relieved, I went upstairs to my second-floor apartment and forgot all about the incident. I didn't see the guy again for a few days. It had mostly drifted to the back of my mind, but my car was still in the shop, so whenever I walked home from work, I did keep an eye out for any strange men following me. I was home free, or so I thought. It was around 1:30 a.m. when I woke up, startled. You see, I live alone, no roommates, no pets, nothing. I'm usually a heavy sleeper, so when I snapped awake, I figured something must have alerted me. I could just kind of feel a sense of wrongness and unease in the air. You know when you'd enter a house as a kid and you could just tell if someone is or isn't home? It felt like that, but of course nobody was supposed to be here. And I strained my ears to listen. Nothing. all was quiet, but then I smelled it. Something fishy. Literally, that is the unmistakable strong smell of dead fish wafting through my apartment. Of course, my mind immediately went back to my stalker, a label that I'd just given him even though I'd only seen him that one time. Maybe deep down some part of me knew that he would be back. And I listened, trying to make out any noise over the sound of my own panicked breathing. A clatter sounded from the living room, and then a sort of muttered voice. Yeah, it definitely wasn't my imagination. Someone was in my damn apartment. Ever since the guy had followed me home, I'd been thinking about this eventuality. I didn't own a gun back then, something I've since rectified, but I did have my brother's baseball bat. He'd given it to me when I'd moved down to the coast, mostly as a joke, but told me to keep it on hand to protect myself. I'd quickly moved in, put it in the closet, and forgotten about it. But I'd been sleeping with the bat beside my bed ever since the guy followed me home. I grabbed the bat now and crept into the living room in my t-shirt and shorts. As soon as I left the room, I saw how the intruder had gotten in. The front door was busted open. We later found out that the wood must have been rotted around the latch or something, because he'd seemingly used some kind of tool to crack it open. No wonder I'd woken up. The man at the moment was standing in my living room, right there in the darkness. He wasn't moving. He was still holding that damn bag, and as I crept closer, the stink of rancid fish grew stronger. It suddenly struck me that I had no idea what I was going to do. My phone was charging in the kitchen, which opened onto the living room on the other side of Fish Intruder. I couldn't call the cops without going through him, and from the way he was swaying on that spot, he seemed to be drunk or high or something. But from what I could remember of him in the daylight of the previous week, he'd been fairly well built. Definitely strong enough to cause me some serious harm if he chose to, even if I was armed with a baseball bat. I really didn't like the idea of head-to-head confrontation with this dude, and that's why I was so relieved, if not a bit surprised, when he suddenly collapsed to the ground. Well, he didn't collapse really. It was like, you know how little kids suddenly just sit down out of nowhere? It was like that. He just sort of dropped to the ground in a sitting position, froze there for a moment, and then began rummaging through his bag of dead fish. Ugh. If the smell had been bad before, it was terrible now. The foul, rotting stench of seafood wafted up and out of that bag, causing me to gag. I remember stifling my breath and crept out of the outskirts of the room, but my eyes were glued to the man the entire time. He was fascinated by whatever deceased rancid fish he was digging through. I caught my hip on the side table and almost knocked over a lamp. Freezing, I checked to see if the guy had heard me, but he hadn't. I swallowed, darted for the kitchen, grabbed the phone off the counter and ran straight to the bathroom. It was the only other door in the apartment with a lock. Seeing as how the guy had smashed his way through the front door, I didn't have much confidence in the flimsy lock that sealed the door, so I called 911 as quickly as I could. The operator asked me what was going on, and I told her, and then got transferred to dispatch, and they got me to stay on the line while the cops double-timed it over to my place. While I waited, I could hear footsteps from my apartment. It was too soon for it to be the cops, plus they hadn't announced themselves, so I knew the guy was on the move. Part of me wanted him to leave, and part of me wanted to be sure that the cops actually caught him. I whispered at the phone what was going on, and the operator told me to stay put. Under no circumstances should I leave the bathroom, and the cops would be there shortly. I heard a crash from the apartment, and later I'd found out that it was the same lamp that I had almost knocked over myself. The guy had also bumped into that table, wandering around. It was silent for a moment in the apartment, and then I heard a creak right outside the bathroom door. This was followed by another burst of that dead fish stench, and I think I started crying at this point, telling the operator he was right outside the bathroom door. I had no idea what he might do to me or what he even had in mind. And it felt like hours later, but it must have only been a matter of minutes. I heard shouting, the voices of cops, then a scuffle. I yelled out, and a cop called back to me saying to stay put, and then the sound of something breaking, more banging, and footsteps leaving the apartment. There was a knock on the bathroom door, and the gentle, welcoming voice of a female officer told me it was safe to come out. My hands were shaking, and I unlocked the door and stepped out. I was surprised that fish man hadn't caused much more damage. The lamp was laying there broken on the hallway floor, and for some reason he'd also removed a framed movie poster I had on the wall and smashed the glass. To cut a long aftermath short, it turned out that the guy was a local fisherman who'd apparently fallen on hard times. It was kind of a tragic story. He'd lost his business, then his family, then his sobriety, and then, I guess, his sanity. This wasn't the first time he'd been in trouble with the law, but it was the first time he'd broken into someone's home. We have no idea what he intended to do with me, if anything, and frankly, I prefer not to know. Also unexplained is why he was carrying around a bag of dead fish, other than the fact that it was something that he was known to do. His fish transporting days were over, though. The guy was incarcerated in a psychiatric hospital and, to my knowledge, is still receiving the much-required treatment he needs. And I honestly wish him no ill will, and it could have been a lot worse. That doesn't change the fact that he did still break into my apartment, though, and he clearly had something in mind by doing so. He definitely followed me home that one day, and then returned a few days later, which suggests a degree of intent. I make myself feel better by reminding myself that the mental illness, alcohol, and whatever drugs he'd used cooked his brain to a point that it blitzed all of his mental faculties. I couldn't stay in that apartment for long after that, though. Thankfully, the landlord let me out of my lease early, and I moved right over to the other side of town. I don't think that I could have tolerated staying in that place because, for one thing, I could never get rid of that lingering smell of dead fish. So a while ago, I met this amazing girl on Tinder. We clicked really well over chat and met up for a few dates. She was perfect, sweet, lovely, had a great sense of humor, and was pretty hot to boot. Can you tell that I regret how things went with her? Now, I'll warn you up front, this is one of the most shameful stories of my life, and I still feel really bad about it, even though it must have been nearly 7 years ago now. After a few dates, the girl, I'll just call her Kara, shyly asked me if I'd like to stay over at her place after we'd been out to dinner and the movies. Of course, I said yes. We had a great night, a great meal, and I don't remember what movie we saw, but I remember enjoying it. Back at Kara's place, it was pretty obvious that this was our night to get physical. We'd only held hands and kissed a bit previously, but that night we got straight to it, so to speak. Now, I won't go into gritty details, especially because of what happened next, but it was one of the best nights of my life. It makes it all the more bittersweet with what came after. Eventually, we fell asleep in each other's arms in her bed and slept for a few hours. I woke up to the sound of breaking glass and 2 figures bursting into the room. I was stunned and had no idea how to react. It was all sort of a blur. They manhandled me out of the bed and dragged me into the living room. I wish I could say that my first reaction was to try and protect Kara, but mostly I was just so scared that all I could do was flail and yell like an idiot. One of them had a knife, and the other had some kind of baton. I didn't feel like testing whether they'd use either. They tied me to a dining chair, and then they went and got Kara. When they brought her out, the 2 hooded masked figures were a lot more gentle with her, I noticed. Now, I should note, I am a naturally suspicious person. I tend to overthink everything and maybe back myself into a corner because of it. Now, I will be the first to admit that this is not a nice trait, and this story is intended to be a cautionary tale about being like me. Don't approach everyone with suspicion, it will come back to bite you in the ass. Now, with that aside, back in the living room, the two masked men, and I could tell from their voices that they were dudes, were rummaging through my overnight bag. They took my expensive watch from the bedroom and dangled it in front of me, asking if it was real or fake. I told them it was fake. They didn't believe me, and into their bag it went. Then they forced me to unlock my phone. They did this by threatening to hurt Kara in very unspecified ways. Again, I kept noticing that they were actually pretty gentle with her, and I don't know why that just kept sticking in my mind, but it did. I don't think I paid much attention to it in the moment, but I definitely did after the fact. Regardless, though, I unlocked my phone and they changed the passcode to ensure they could access and, I assume, wipe it. This meant, of course, they'd have access to my bank details, my Apple Pay service, which was fairly new at the time, my iTunes account, and they could do a lot of damage with this info. Finally, they went through my wallet. These a-holes even shredded up a photo that I had in there of my sister, her husband, my niece and nephew, just spiteful, angry robbers who wanted to upset me, which again made me suspicious. Was there a personal angle here? How did they get in? Why did they break in? I was gagged, so I couldn't ask them any of this, and eventually they stole what cash I had in my wallet, took my cards too, and just left. They didn't rob Kara at all that I saw. They didn't search for her handbag or purse, didn't steal anything from the apartment. It was just me. I was the sole target. Afterwards, dealing with the cops, I started to get more and more suspicious. It seemed like one of the officers did too, because he kept asking me how well I knew Kara, if it seemed like Kara knew the assailants, etc. I guess this is where the seed was really planted in my mind. We filed police reports, I canceled my cards, reported my phone stolen. Thankfully, they didn't take anything out of my bank account, but they disabled my Find My iPhone, and I'm sure they managed to jailbreak or wipe and sell it. In the days after, I sunk into a spiral of paranoia about it all. Kara was being evasive with me, I thought, and didn't seem to want to talk to me. I kept trying to ask her if she had any idea who the home invaders were or why they'd targeted us. She said she had no idea, but told me that while they broke the glass, they had gotten in through an open window in the living room. And I guess I was kind of a jerk about that because I replied a little snappily saying that I would have preferred to know that the place was actually locked up before staying there. Then, when she stopped replying, I started sending her messages about why the thieves had targeted me specifically. And at first, I sort of framed it like, hey, why do you think it went down like this? And then I started getting a bit more direct. I told her it was incredibly convenient that only I had been robbed and that she was totally fine. I could tell this hurt her and also made her mad because she started getting pretty angry and defensive about that. And I just like to say now that I don't blame her. I was a complete jerk and I deserve to be chewed out about it. I guess all I can say in my defense is that I was pretty traumatized from the event and I didn't really know Kara all that well. And in the end, after it seemed like the case had gone cold and there was no hope of the police catching these people, I just flat out accused her of setting me up. And she lost it at me, of course, which in retrospect I fully deserved. Again, I cannot stress how bad I feel about all this, and as you can probably guess, Kara did not set me up. The reason I suspected it, other than the behavior of the thieves, was that I'd become sure that I had identified at least one of the culprits. Kara had an ex-boyfriend, who I found by stalking her Facebook and Twitter profiles, and it seemed like she'd kicked him to the curb and he wasn't very happy about it. He was a weaselly, wiry-looking guy with a very snide expression, and I didn't much like him. His social media feed was filled with performative nice guy self-pitying crap, which also rubbed me the wrong way, and I discovered from his own Twitter posts that he had a record for breaking and entering and had narrowly avoided juvie as a kid. Hilariously, he was an upper-middle-class guy with a chip on his shoulder who acted like the world owed him a favor, but really his rich parents had gotten him off that charge. In my conspiracy brain-coded mind, I put 2 and 2 together and came up with 5. A scenario where Kara and Nice Guy had faked their breakup on social media and were luring in poor, unsuspecting Tinder dates like myself to be robbed at knife point. I even went so far as to tell the cops my theory, and they said they'd look into it. I have no idea if they ever interviewed this nice guy, but I hope they did. I also became certain that the other thief had been my friend Bill, who he also interacted with on social media. I built up this whole narrative in my head. In the end, I completely cut off Kara, convinced that she'd been responsible for one of the worst nights of my life. For the next 6 months, I callously recounted the story of the Tinder date who scammed me to a few friends, until one day something stopped me dead in my tracks. It was a news story about a breaking and entering gone wrong, where a woman in my town had been the victim of a break-in and assault and suffered life-changing injuries as a result. It was Kara, and the culprit was Nice Guy. I've been so fixated on the idea that Kara was in on it that I never considered the possibility that I was mostly right, but wrong about that part. From what I can gather, Nice Guy did break in out of jealousy and did rob me in revenge, but Kara wasn't part of that plan. He simply wanted to scare her out of dating anyone else. When that clearly failed, he grew more and more jealous and I guess eventually went back for Kara, this time causing permanent damage to her. I guess there's still a tiny possibility that Kara was complicit in the first home invasion, but I really don't think so. Instead, I blamed an innocent girl for the actions of her awful ex, and then left her to deal with him. I've spent the last few years trying to forgive myself for this, because I sure as heck won't be asking Kara for forgiveness. That woman's heard enough from me for a lifetime. This happened to me in early 2024, and I'm still receiving counseling about it. So I'm a college student in my final year, and at the time I rented a house with a couple of friends. We were away for spring break, and our house got broken into. It was heartbreaking. A whole bunch of stuff was taken, a MacBook Air, our PlayStation, and a bunch of cash that one of my roommates kept hidden under their mattress. Who knew people really did that these days? Thankfully, it was only a few $100s, but still, that's a lot of money to broke-ass bitches like us. I remember coming home buzzing but tired from the vacation and just staring in dismay at the door standing there, ajar. We went in carefully, probably should have called the cops first, and were just met with chaos. These thieves hadn't actually taken all that much, but they'd thrown everything around and made the biggest damn mess with books, food items, throwing the couch cushions around. Thankfully, I kept my room locked, so I thought that they didn't bust in there. But one of my roommates, the one who kept the cash under her mattress, her stuff all got trashed. We spent that night in a motel, and then the next day began the long and upsetting task of cleaning up our life. My roommate's boyfriends and a couple of our friends all pitched in to help, and by the end of the day, things were almost back to normal, minus the shared laptop we kept in the living room, the PlayStation, a bunch of food we had to throw out, and things like that. From the next day, we were tasked with itemizing all the missing items, and at first it seemed like it was only a handful of things, which I've mentioned. Then as time passed, we started noticing more missing items, an expensive crock pot that I'd brought from home, a photography book that we kept on the living room bookshelf, and disturbingly a framed photo of the three of us from spring break the year before this. I hated the idea of the thief having our photo, especially since we were posing in bikinis, and I've never wanted them to frame that and put it up in the first place. It just sort of felt weird having it on display. And this kind of made me start suspecting that what if the thief was someone who knew us? And maybe I was reading too much into it. Maybe he'd just been some dirty perv who saw 3 college girls in bikinis and decided to stash it for the spank bank while he played on our stolen PlayStation. And the thought wouldn't leave me though, and it began to bother me more and more. I started pushing my roommates to keep checking if anything else was missing, smaller items that we wouldn't necessarily be able to claim on insurance and could maybe give me a clue as to who had broken into my house. My roommates and the cops kept reminding me that there had been a bunch of burglaries, and it was likely just an opportunistic thief, but I was really fixating on the idea of a stalker or being targeted somehow. My other roommate noticed that some of her clothes were missing, particularly a few items of underwear. She couldn't say for sure that they'd been stolen. She said that she might have left them on spring break. Not in that kind of way, just forgotten in the hotel. But I knew that she was just trying to make me feel better. They'd been stolen, just like the photo and our PlayStation. The money mattress roommate then noticed that a couple of pieces of jewelry had gone missing. None of her clothes, though. They were all accounted for. I remarked that I was extremely grateful that the thief hadn't gotten into my stuff, which is when my roommates pointed out that the lock that I have on my door, even though you lock it from the inside, is possible to open and close from the outside with a screwdriver or something similar. I immediately began checking my things, because my room hadn't been disturbed and because nothing of value was obviously missing. I hadn't even thought to check. Imagine my relief when I couldn't find anything missing at all. All my clothing, underwear, keepsakes, and even a pretty expensive necklace I'd inherited from my grandma. If the thief had gone in my room, he would have stolen that, obviously. I was lying in bed one night, struggling to sleep with paranoia, when I noticed something on my side dresser. I turned on the lamp, got out of bed, and went over to it. It was a pen, a cheap-looking ballpoint pen. Now, it was a bit of a nicer one, like the kind that you get in banks or something, and I picked it up, scribbled on a bit of paper, and it didn't work. Strange. I just shrugged and then threw it in the trash. Now, back in bed, thoughts were whirling around my head, and I continued to fail to sleep. Something about the pen just being on my dresser without me remembering it was bothering me. What if? No. It couldn't be, could it? And I began studying my room, my photo board, my paintings, my computer, my shelf of plushies. There was a teddy bear sitting there among them that caught my eye. I tried to think, when had I gotten that one? I didn't recognize it, and I was sure I didn't recognize it. Hiding under the covers, I reached out and snatched my nearby robe, and then pulled it on under cover. Finally wrapped up, I climbed out of bed, hit the lights, and went over to the teddy. It was an expensive-looking bear, and I definitely didn't remember buying it. Picking it up, I could feel something hard inside its body. Its glassy eyes stared at me, dead shark eyes in a cute little teddy bear. Was it my imagination, or could I see a little glint in the eye? I turned the bear over, and sure enough, there was a slit I could open. I reached in and felt a large, hard object. I tore it free from the bear, and once again, sure enough, it looked to be a spy cam. I was horrified. I threw it face down and began to scour the room for other devices. And in total, I found the teddy, the pen, a smiley face badge, a plush snail, and then finally, hidden in my bathroom, a second spy cam pen. Of course, I freaked out. Even though it was the middle of the night, I called the cops and woke up my roommates. I was frantic, insisting that we check my light switches, all the fixtures, and all that kind of stuff. Hey, I've seen plenty of spy movies and creeper-type stories. I'm pretty sure I know where they hide these types of things. They helped me dismantle everything while the cops bagged up what I had found. We didn't find anything more, and I don't know if that made me feel better or worse. I couldn't shake the idea that there had to be more, but I'd never know. The cameras were broadcasting wirelessly, which meant that there was no actual way to tell what was receiving that signal. And I assumed law enforcement would be able to trace those things, but apparently the tech available, at least to civilian crime stuff, isn't that advanced. I'm sure they could probably have worked on it if the cameras had been planted in, say, the Pentagon, but it just wasn't worth the expense for some weird home invasion. And so in short, someone broke into our apartment, made it look like a robbery, then planted spy cams in my room, which were left undiscovered for a few days. I tried not even to think about the amount of times I'd undressed or been in a vulnerable position in front of those cameras. If I do, it still makes me feel sick to my stomach. I could not stay in that room after that, and my roommates were paranoid that they'd been bugged too, even though we could never find any other cameras. We stayed with various friends and kept returning to that house to scour for cameras but never found any more. And it really screwed with all of us, honestly, and I'd be lying if I said that we were over it. The absolute scariest thing to me is knowing that the spy cams left in her house were fairly basic, cheap ones that you can find in Walmart or on Amazon. Why does that scare me? Because they don't broadcast very far. And this suggests that the culprit was nearby, maybe one of our neighbors. Maybe it just means that whoever put them there wasn't getting a signal, and I hope to God that was the case. But all I can picture is some creepy perv guy watching me changing from his living room next door, and even sitting in a car outside our place. I've never felt safe since this happened, and I hope that one day I can finally get over it. So I got a bit of a weird one for you that happened to me and the fam quite a few years ago now. Myself, my wife, and my 3 kids decided we wanted a break from big city life, just for a bit. It was the mid-2010s, and there was a big spike in crime in our city, and things were just feeling really oppressive and bleak. We needed a palate cleanser, which is why we jumped at the opportunity when my buddy Derek offered us use of his hunting lodge over the Thanksgiving week. I'd been on hunting trips with Derek and the boys before, but this would be something different. Just my family, free use of Derek's excellent cabin, and some quiet, chill, quality family time without any distractions or disturbances. The cabin was just off of a forest community near the base of Grand Teton. There's a small town nearby, then a 30-minute drive will take you to the cabins. My buddy's cabin is relatively isolated. Then there are a couple of neighbors on the other side of the medium lake nearby. Me and the family made the 6-hour road trip to the cabin. Our youngest is 4, and she kept needing us to stop for breaks, so the journey was a little stressful, but by the time we arrived, it was taking everything in my wife and I's power to keep the kids from killing each other. It wasn't the first time they'd visited the cabin, so as soon as we pulled up, the kids spilled out of the car and darted onto the porch, throwing the front door of the cabin open. I was climbing out of our Ford when I saw my eldest, Lisa, she's 10, freeze in the entrance and then come running back to us. Her face was a look of absolute embarrassment. "Daddy?" she said, breathless. Then, when she finished telling me what she'd seen, I had to ask her to repeat herself. And in short, there was someone already in the cabin. I had no idea what was going on, so I sprinted up the stairs and burst into that place. My youngest daughter, who's 4, and our middle son, who's 8, were standing there, frozen to the spot. My son is autistic and not the best with strangers, and my 4-year-old was, 4, so I don't blame them for not knowing how to handle the situation. A guy was sitting on the couch in the center of the hunting cabin's open living room, reclined back in his boxers. He was holding a beer, and even though it was only mid-afternoon, I could see a bunch of other empty bottles littering the ground. I asked him what the hell he was doing in there, and I admit that I may have been a little aggressive, but only because Lisa had seemed so bothered by the guy. She thought he'd been, touching himself when she burst in, which obviously filled me with rage. The guy springs up from the couch and held up his hands in a gesture of surrender. Now, I'd been ready for a fight, but this thin, wiry guy didn't look like much of a threat. Then he smiled and laughed and seemed to catch his breath. He said his name was Blake and told me his last name as well. And long story short, he explained that he was a buddy of Derek's from high school. Derek had told him that the cabin would be free over Thanksgiving, and since he was going through a messy and very painful divorce, he was welcome to stay over the holiday to clear his mind. And then we had a good laugh about this because it was so completely Derek. We called him the bubblehead blonde. He was what the kids today call a himbo. Everything made total sense. Blake even seemed like a real nice guy. And I was beginning to wonder how we'd rectify the situation, though, when Blake said he'd happily move on. He lived an hour or so away, so it was only a small hop, skip, and a jump to the cabin, and he didn't want to put the kibosh on a family vacation. The polite part of me wanted to offer to let him stay, but the hunting cabin didn't exactly have many bedrooms, and our kids needed their own space. especially my son James, who, as I mentioned, is autistic and takes time to adjust to new situations. Grateful, I took Blake up on his offer. He asked if it could be possible for us to give him a couple of hours so he could wash up, pack up, and actually head out, and it seemed reasonable to me. The local town was only about a 20-minute drive away, and there was no cell reception at the cabin, so I figured that I'd drive there and call up Derek, let him know how the chaos had all gone down. Me and the family piled back into the car, wished Blake well, and drove down the winding trail to the village. Once we were there, we headed into the general store, bought a few snacks, and treated the kids to some ice cream, and then I called up Derek. I didn't outright tell him that he double-booked us. I decided to mention his friend Blake and sort of let him figure it out. And when I did, what Derek said caused a shiver to run down my spine. I'll never forget it, word for word. He said, quote, "Blake? That prick? That guy who used to bully me in high school? I heard he was busted on drugs charges." I think at first I thought Derek was pranking me because I grilled him on it and told him that a guy called Blake had been at the cabin. Derek began to get more and more frantic with me when I was skeptical, eventually yelling at me to listen and take him seriously. And that snapped me out of whatever doubts I might have had. Derek never yelled, and he never got mad. He told me to return to the cabin with the cops and to have my wife and kids stay in town for now. He even offered to Venmo me the money for a motel for all of us, but I told him not to worry. And then he called his buddy at the sheriff's department and had him and an officer meet me on the outskirts of town and take a ride back to the cabin in that cruiser. And when we got there, the front door was hanging wide open. The place had been utterly trashed, completely and totally ruined. The TV was smashed. All the various glasses were in pieces on the floor. The couch was shredded with what seemed to be a knife. The deputy and the officer made me wait outside at first while they checked the place, but I soon followed them in, hot-blooded and angry. Swear words had been spray-painted on the wall of the master bedroom, and based on the fact that the paint was dry and the extent of some of the damage, law enforcement figured that the vandalism must have started long before my family and I arrived at the cabin. I guess Blake had been planning a little payback against Derek for some time, and we just sort of interrupted him. Why? It was hard to tell. Like Derek said, Blake had bullied him in high school and eventually been expelled for it, among many, many other things. He then went down a very dark path of drug manufacturing, apparently running a meth lab in a trailer park somewhere, but he'd been released on some type of technicality after that, and instead of him trying to turn his life around, he'd gotten hooked on the meth himself and decided to go on an all-out tour of vengeance and destruction. I have no idea if Derek's cabin was his first stop, but he'd certainly been filled with that enthusiasm. When I saw what he'd left in the bathroom, I had to cover my mouth and step outside. What a disgusting individual. And it made me furious to know that this chuckle effer had met my family. He'd spoken to us, smiled with us, laughed with us, all the while knowing that he was there for violence. I was just thinking how infinitely grateful I was that he decided to trash the place and leave, when I heard a creak from the ceiling above us, and then a bunch of coughing, more creaks, and more coughing. There was an attic crawl space in the cabin, and it was apparent to myself and the two cops that something, or someone, was up there. I showed them where the hatch was that led to that crawl space. The deputy pulled it open and a ladder unfolded. A head peeked out. He was covered in dust and filth, but I recognized Blake immediately. And thankfully, he handed himself over. He was too drunk and high to resist, and that stifling air in the cabin attic had started to trigger his asthma, of all things. And he was brought down and taken into the cop car in handcuffs. By now, a handful more of cops had arrived, and Derek's buddy deputy drove me back into town while other officers secured the scene. Thankfully, I didn't have to share a ride with Blake. My wife and kids and I didn't stay in the cabin over Thanksgiving after all. I booked us into a nice little hotel in town, and we got to experience the place Derek had grown up. He had to come up to assess the damage, so he brought his wife and stepdaughter, who is my youngest daughter's best pal, and we made a good week of it after all. Derek was surprisingly unfazed by the cabin invasion and damage, but I guess that's Derek for you. The most chilling aspect of all of this was what they found in the guest bedroom. Blake had come equipped with rope, duct tape, a hatchet, and a handgun. It turned out he did have a license for that gun, and we have no way of knowing what he intended to do with those things, or if he did actually have nefarious intent. But knowing an unhinged guy like that had been lurking in my family's vacation cabin, ready to snap at any time, well, let's just say that Blake is not someone I plan on vacationing with in the future. So I got a bit of a crazy story for you that happened to me a few weeks ago. I'm in the UK and we have a bit of an epidemic on our hands. I don't mean COVID or anything like that. I'm talking about IRL streamers. Have you ever heard of a little tow rag called Secret Mizzy? He's a 20-year-old man-child called Bakari Bronze Ogario, who in 2023 used to film himself pranking members of the public by breaking into people's houses while live streaming. Hilarious, right? He allegedly did a bunch of stuff like breaking and entering, theft, property damage, etc. And I say allegedly because I don't remember which things he got charged for and which he didn't, and I don't care enough about that little scrote to go digging. Either way, he ended up serving 6 weeks in prison for it, and then came out and gave an interview about how he's turning his life around. And props to him, I guess, maybe he will, but that doesn't change the fact that he inspired a bunch of dumbass TikTok kids and overgrown kids to follow in his idiot footsteps. Now, I'm just going to insert this in here. I did go and look him up to find out his actual name, and it seems like he's got a kid. Christ, poor child. I hope Secret Mizzy turns his life around for the sake of that kid, if nothing else. Anyway, this isn't about him. This is about a guy in my year at college who I guess thought Secret Mizzy was the coolest Mother Hubbard in the whole of Stockton-on-Tees. I remember overhearing him at college with the girls and rolling my eyes hard as he was playing those dumb Secret Mizzy clips. This was this year too, 2025. Imagine still idolizing this guy a year after he'd served hard time for his stupid TikTok actions. I'm only 18, but people say I'm old and grumpy for my age, and maybe that shows, but holy heck, I cannot relate to some people of my generation. This guy, who I kid you not called himself the Jizzler, well, he was particularly unrelatable. Also, horror of horrors, he had a crush on me, so he'd often lurk around me at college, flanked by his idiot friends who just guffawed at his lame jokes and encouraged him to do stupid stunts like leaping down the stairs and filming it, pranking the teachers and other students, all that kind of obnoxious stuff. He would film it and also live stream it to TikTok, where he had something like 10 followers. Secret Mizzy, he was not. This lameo couldn't even troll well. The Jizzler wasn't really someone I thought about unless I had to, but that day in March when this happened, he didn't leave me any choice. I'd walked from college with my bestie Annalise, and we were hanging out at my place doing media studies homework. My dad and stepmom were out with my baby brother and wouldn't be back until late that night. It was just past 6 when the doorbell rang. I went to answer it, figuring it was an Amazon delivery driver or something. The Jizzler and one of his stupid mates stood on the doorstep. They absolutely reeked of spirits, and as I looked, Jizzler took a deep inhale from a balloon. Whippets and all that crap had been all the rage at our college this year, and Jizzler was particularly fond of killing a few brain cells before committing his latest stunt. I didn't even have time to react. He shoved his way into my house, leaving his mate on the doorstep. Alarmed, I quickly slammed the door, locking the mate out. That didn't deter Jizzler, though, who was staggering and stumbling his way down my hallway, holding his phone up on a selfie stick. He was narrating into the phone, but his words made no sense. Whatever he was on or had been drinking, it had scrambled his brain. Jizzler reeled and staggered down the hall. He knocked into the side table and sent an expensive vase crashing to the ground. I shrieked, trying to grab at him, and he shoved me hard against the wall, sending family photos crashing to the ground. In that moment, I was incensed. He couldn't do this. This was a crime. I shouted as much at him, and he just laughed and didn't seem to care at all. I followed him into the living room, grabbing at him, trying to stop this maniac. Annalise had come running from the kitchen to see what was going on, and she looked horrified. Annalise is a quiet, shy, gentle person, the polar opposite to me, someone who does not shy from picking a fight if I feel an injustice is occurring. Gisler was picking up my parents' things, his phone held up all the while, and he found my grand's ornament cupboard, which we'd inherited from her when she went into the home. And oh no, all her little glass models and ornaments, swans, dogs, clowns, things like that. Gisler turned so the camera was filming him and reached behind him, sweeping ornaments off the shelf. They crashed to the ground, shattering, and I began to scream, and so did Annalise. Gisler just laughed, grabbing another ornament and flinging it at the wall. I lunged at him again, slapping and trying to claw at him, but I guess whatever drugs and alcohol he is on made him oblivious to any pain. Instead, he shoved me again, even harder, and I fell back and jarred my back against the fireplace. Instant pain as my tailbone connected with the grate, and I started sobbing. Meanwhile, the Gisler was now pulling the settee cushions off and throwing them around. Our living room had a lot of fragile things on display, and he was damaging all of it. One hard throw of a cushion caused the TV to topple to the ground and actually spark. Next, he was using his phone on the selfie stick to smash the light fixtures above his head. I was freaking out. Annalise, meanwhile, had fully disappeared. I felt a moment's anger at her. How could she leave me with this lunatic? But then she reappeared, and she was holding a phone in one hand, which I could see had an active call, and a kitchen knife in the other. She yelled at the Gisler to stop. He did pause, looking at her holding the knife, and then began to let out the most insane, hooting laugh. That's when I noticed that the phone he was holding didn't even seem to be switched on. This absolute maroon thought that he was live streaming his whole rampage, but he was too drunk and high to notice his battery had obviously died. Annalise told him that the cops were on their way, and that he'd better stop. Instead of stopping, Mr. Jizzy grabbed an ornament from above the fireplace. I scrambled to get out of his way and looked up at what he had. Oh no, Granddad's ashes. The Gisler had grabbed the urn with Granddad's ashes in it and was holding it recklessly in the air. I jumped to my feet and shouted the only thing I could think of. "That's my bloody Granddad!" I expected him to hurl the urn at me or something, but instead it was like this sort of snapped him out of it. It felt like I'd slapped him or thrown cold water in his face. He stared at me, and suddenly a look of stupidity and shame crossed his face. I saw him looking around the living room. A sick expression formed, and he very gently, almost comically, put Granddad's urn back on the mantelpiece and then collapsed onto the living room settee until the cops arrived. Long story short, this happened a couple of months ago, and the case is still ongoing. We don't think it'll go to court. The Gisler's family are paying for the damage and trying to persuade us to drop the charges, which I guess we might. Turns out he'd gotten super drunk on his day off from college and then dropped a few pills that he'd gotten from a mate. Then he did the nitrous, and I guess it made him go temporarily insane. I do feel a tiny bit bad for this stupid kid. He's not going to be able to complete his A-levels, and he's kind of tanked his life a bit, but I can never forgive him for terrorizing me and almost smashing my beloved Granddad's ashes. I don't have any home invasion stories per se because I'm homeless. Or I guess they call it unhoused these days because sure, that's the kind of thing people like me worry about, nomenclature and word use. Now anyways, I'm being a bit flippant, I do get it. It's why I realize that I do have a home invasion story even though, you see, I live in my car. And to me, that car is home. I've lived this kind of nomadic lifestyle for quite a few years, thanks to a combination of being down on my luck and also wanting to kind of stay off grid. I'm doing okay these days, so you and your listeners don't need to worry about me, and I love having Let's Read by my side in the cold or, right now, extremely hot nights while I camp out in my car. And when this happened, I had a different car with a nice back seat. This occurred in the winter of 2018, and it was a bitter one. I was parked in a lot in the middle of nowhere, bundled up in my sleeping bags in the back of the '87 Ford Fiesta I called home. I was dead to the world, completely asleep. I woke up to the sound and sensation of my world being shifted, though. Quite literally, in fact. My car was moving. What the hell, I thought? The sleep cleared from my head, and from under the sleeping bag, I heard two young-sounding voices. They were talking about taking the car for a joyride and having some quote-unquote fun in the fields. Apparently, they'd scored big by finding this abandoned car all by itself in the lot. Well, damn, I guess I'd been carjacked. Except I was still in the car, and they didn't know. So bear in mind, we were driving along at a decent speed by then, and I also had absolutely no idea who these kids were or what they might do. I decided that the only course of action I had was to hunker down, hide under the sleeping bags, and hope they got bored. I knew the area, and knew the kids around here were mostly good kids, just bored farm guys and dumb university students. I figured these guys were the former. They had local accents, and from their silly conversations, they honestly didn't sound like bad kids. On the other hand, they had stolen my car and seemingly hotwired it and were taking it for a joyride, so they can't have been that nice. I knew they must have hotwired the car because I had the keys in my pocket, and I was always particular about ensuring the car was locked and the keys were on me before going to sleep. Hell, I normally didn't sleep in the back seat in case I needed to make a quick getaway, but it was so cold that I'd taken to doing it at the time. The car was bumping and flying over potholes. We were clearly in backwoods countryside now, moving away from the coast into more touristy parts of Weston. I distinctly felt it when the car turned off the country lane and into a field. We were bumping and bouncing so hard that I felt my teeth chattering together. Recounting the story now, I probably sound pretty calm, but I was completely bloody terrified at the time. The more I wake up and my mind cleared, the more I realized what deep doo-doo I was in. They could crash and kill us all, or maybe they'd turn around and realize, hey, the homeless chump who owns this car is still here and we better not leave him alive to ID us. I couldn't even see them, remember? I was hidden under sleeping bags and too afraid to peek out, but I figured the two bored kids probably hadn't taken the precaution to wear a mask. They drove around for a while and I was genuinely plotting my escape. My options were to spring up and surprise them and try to appeal to their good nature or leap out of the moving vehicle. They weren't going too fast, and it felt like we were on muddy ground, so I was honestly preparing to take my chances with a sudden exit. What I'd do when I got out of the car, I had no idea. I didn't have to work it out, though, because very shortly after deciding I was going to jump, the car pulled to a sudden stop. The kids were muttering something about being bored. In hope of hopes, I thought I might be getting off scot-free. I even heard both of them slam the doors behind them as they left. And that's when I heard breaking glass, and then smelled the smoke. What do joyriders usually do when they're done with an abandoned car? Well, in this case, they torch it. And that's exactly what happened here. I had no idea if this is a regular occurrence in the States, but here in the UK, it was almost a rite of passage for some kids to steal a car, take it on a joyride, and then light it on fire. They'd usually target old, abandoned cars or even their own if they had reached the end of its life. Burning it and dumping it is cheaper than disposing of a car officially. So the kids had thrown a makeshift Molotov cocktail through the open window, and of course, they didn't know that I was still in the car. Flames were licking up the front passenger seat already as I tore my sleeping bags off and tried to open the back door. It was locked. I fumbled with the awkward manual lock and then began to panic. I banged on the window. This got the attention of the joyriders, and I finally saw them. They were gesturing to me, and it looked like they were talking frantically. For a moment, I thought they'd leave me there, let the witness burn with the evidence, so to speak. Thankfully, they were better kids than you might expect. I guess in retrospect, that's why it's easy for me to say that. They ran to the car, smashed the windows, and then helped me get free. What followed was a panicked, tearful plea of contrition as the three of us ran from the field, none of us really wanting to have to deal with the cops. The boys were home from uni and swore they genuinely thought the car was abandoned. They said their friend told them that it had been there for weeks, and I choose to believe them. I've never seen two kids more sick with guilt and worry, and while it caused me some short-term inconvenience, I don't regret my decision to write the car off and abandon it. The boys' families were incredible, kind and understanding, and they made sure things were and are right with me, and in them I found friends for life. It was a very happy ending to a story of extreme irresponsibility, but at the time it was absolutely terrifying. They know I'm sending this story to you, and I think them and their family will get a kick out of it if you do actually run it. I've changed some details majorly, and it didn't really happen near Weston. We picked that location for a reason. We stay in touch to this day, and they've helped me more than I can ever express. But it's incredibly bizarre to think that I met these people by them stealing my home with me in it and driving me almost to my doom. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, beware the Jizzler.